Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Welcome back to another episode of Mosin Markings. Today we're taking a look at an older marking, particularly from the World War I time era. And the first rifle we're going to be looking at here today is actually a St. Petersburg cavalry carbine, which has this cool sling swivel at the back. Now, the marking in question, like I said, it's an older marking, is going to be this B in a circle marking here. And I'm going to zoom in on it, but typically you'll see this marking on the right-hand side of the barrel shank, okay? So let's zoom in here so we can get a little bit better look at this rascal. So again, the marking in question here today is this guy. It looks like a capital Latin B, which we see here, within a circle, and it's typically on the upper right-hand side of the barrel shank in this area. I don't typically see this in other places. And the first question is, what is this? And where do we see this on? Now, again, I mentioned this is an older marking. So first of all, we typically see this on rifles from the World War I era. All right, now in particular, this rifle here we can see is marked 1916. And it was made by the Ijev's factory. As you can see here, it's a little bit worn, but this is the Ijev's weapons factory in Russian, 1916. And of course, there's our Ijev's bow and arrow. We did another video on that one. So what does this marking actually mean and why is it interesting? Well, first of all, I want to get through somewhat of a misconception about this marking. You see, if you read maybe some different books, or depending on what literature you're looking at, they might talk about this. Or if you go online, depending on where you go, you might see someone refer to this marking as a Bulgarian marking, i.e. a marking put there either by or on behalf of the country of Bulgaria. However, this is not correct. This is not a Bulgarian marking. And I want to emphasize that straight away because, again, I think that's the most common misconception about this marking. And we pretty much know this for two reasons. Okay, so reason number one is going to be, I think the root of the misconception here is that somebody saw that this is a B and said, oh, that must stand for Bulgaria. That would be one hypothesis on why people think this is a Bulgarian marking. The big problem with that is that in Russian, B, which is, of course, the first letter in Bulgaria, is a different letter. You see, Russia uses the Cyrillic alphabet, and B doesn't look anything like this. It's actually very different. And it's funny because the Russian language does use the Latin B character, but that's really for their version of the letter V, as in Victor. Okay, so this is not a B in Russian. Now, the other problem with this is, well, you might say, well, maybe this was B in Bulgarian, not B in Russian. Well, that doesn't work either because Bulgaria also uses the Cyrillic alphabet, and this is not B in Bulgarian either. So every way you look at it, this is only B in anything that uses the Latin alphabet, like, English or German or something like that. So very unlikely that this marking means this is Bulgaria just off of that. Now, there's another reason why it's unlikely this is a Bulgarian marking. If markings are put on rifles either on behalf of Bulgaria or by Bulgaria, you would probably see this marking on Mosin Nagants from all types of manufacturers from the same period of time. For instance, we're looking here at an Ijev's rifle, but if this was a Bulgarian marking, I would also expect to see this marking on Mosins from other manufacturers that were made in 1916, like the Sistrayetsk factory and the Tula factory. However, I have never ever seen this marking that I'm aware of on either Mosins from either of those two manufacturers. You really only find this marking on rifles from the Ijev's factory in this World War I time period. So that is a really interesting observation. And this is why observation is so important when we're talking about some of these markings, when, these are over 100 years old, and we're talking about 100-year-old Russia. There's really no good documentation on any of this stuff as far as I'm concerned. And so trying to understand what something like this means, we just have to make some deductions and look at a lot of examples in order to form said deductions. And that's what we've done here in this case. So this doesn't mean Bulgaria, and we only see this marking on rifles from the Izhevsk factory. So what does that mean? Well, do we actually know what this means? Well, I actually have an interesting hypothesis on what this means. And I forget, I may have actually seen this hypothesis stated as a possibility in one of Dr. Karl-Heinz Robel's books on the Mosin rifle. But after conducting some observation myself, the theory that I have about this marking, which I believe to be correct, is that this has something to do with rebarreling. Okay, now why do I think that? Well, we're going to look at another example here, but the two examples of rifles we're looking at here today that have this marking are both from the Izhevsk factory, and they both have receivers that don't match the barrels. Okay, now it's unfortunately on this particular gun, it's kind of a pain to take the stock off, so we're not going to be doing that. This is also kind of a pretty valuable and rare stock, so I don't really want to damage it, but you'll have to take my word for it that the receiver marking under the tang, so on the underside back here, is actually marked 1915. Now, it is possible that it was originally like that for the factory. Maybe this was like really early or something. Maybe probably not, because this is already serial number 231,000, but at least there were probably cases where new rifles off the production line maybe had a receiver mismatching the barrel date by maybe plus or minus a year, certainly. However, I don't think that's actually what happened in this case. It seems that in this case, a gun was rebarreled using a potentially newer barrel, okay? And perhaps this was like a certain thing that the Izhevsk factory would do, and when this would happen, they would put this marking on it to signify this was a new barrel. Now, you may not be convinced yet that this exactly was the case, so what I'm going to do now is set this rifle aside, and we're going to take a look at another Izhevsk rifle that bears this marking. So I'm going to set this guy to the side here. All right, and let's go find this other one. Ah, yes, here he is. 1 second as I move this guy into the focus of the camera for today. All right, so this guy's actually out of the stock, which is great because I can actually show you the receiver markings here. Okay, so again, here we have, this is Izhevsk Weapons Factory in Russian, and this guy is a 1914, whereas that last example we were looking at was a 1916. But you'll notice here, what do we see? We see this circle B marking on the top right-hand side of the receiver again. Right there. Okay? Now, what's really interesting about this one is you'll see this crest here on the receiver. This is what appears to be a crest used by the Izhevsk factory around this time period. This looks correct. However, there's one caveat. Let's take a look at the receiver. We're going to flip this guy over here. All right. And what we're going to find is that the receiver marking is actually the hammer signifying the Tula factory from, this is 95, and then this is G in Russian signifying God, which is year, so this would be 1895 that this receiver was built at the Tula factory. This does not match the barrel. So again, it's possible this was produced originally this way from the factory. However, basically all the examples I've looked at of Izhevsk Mosin Nagants from World War I that have this circle B marking, which are pretty much the only Mosins that I've seen that have this circle B marking, have a receiver date that doesn't match the barrel. Is that a coincidence? Probably not. So this is a very interesting marking. So whenever you come across a type of Ijevsk rifle like this from World War I, and if it has that marking, that could be a pretty decent indication that, well, the Ijevsk factory may have rebarreled an older receiver or repaired a receiver with a newer barrel and then stamped this B marking on it. We don't know 100%, but it seems like that is probably the most likely theory right now. So there's a lot of really interesting markings out there for Mosins, especially when we start getting into these earlier time periods of during and even before World War I in some cases. But really, markings like this I find fascinating. It's one of the reasons I got so interested in the Mosin rifle. It's because you have a lot of these markings where nobody really knows what they mean. And so what you have to do is just conduct a lot of analysis yourself in order to come to some hypothesis. And that's what we've done here today. And hopefully we'll get a chance to look at even more rifles that bear this marking in the future to help maybe reinforce our hypothesis, or maybe we can form a new one. And that's typically just what we do with a lot of these markings that we don't have a lot of good info on. I strongly prefer this method over, taking somebody's word for it of what they said in a book or a forum post. You should always take that with a grain of salt. And it's always good to get other opinions as well. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this really interesting circle B marking here today. If you interested in more really cool and interesting Mosin markings, because let's face it, there's a lot of them, please consider subscribing and so you don't miss another episode. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.